Chapter 12: Where the Calorie Myths Came From. One way to clear up all the calorie counting confusion is to start at the beginning and to look at the history of eating using the scale of one day. Say 12 a.m. was the dawn of our first ancestors, and right now it's 1 second before midnight. Up until 11:57 p.m., our ancestors stayed healthy and fit, eating only what could be found directly in nature: vegetables, seafood, meat, eggs, fruits, nuts, and seeds. At 11:57 p.m., things changed. People started farming, became civilized, and only then began eating grains and a small amount of sweets. Just 2 seconds before midnight, people started eating processed starches and processed sweets. And only right now, 1 second before midnight, did people start getting most of their calories from genetically modified and highly manufactured starch and sweetener based edible products. That means that the diet recommended by the government's dietary guidelines was not possible. Forget about healthy or slimming for 99.8% of our history. Our ancestors did not hunt or gather pasta, rice, cereal, or bread. They didn't eat whole grains. They ate no grains. They didn't eat added sweeteners in moderation. They didn't know what added sweeteners were. Emory University anthropologist S. Boyd Eaton, MD, tells us, during the late Paleolithic, the vast majority of human history, the great majority of carbohydrates were derived from vegetables and fruit, very little from cereal grains, and none from refined flours. This idea is interesting to think about when it comes to our health. Obesity, diabetes, and heart disease are called diseases of civilization. They did not become issues until agriculture enabled production of starches and sweets, about 12,000 years ago, and they did not reach epidemic status until starches and sweets became highly processed, were genetically modified, and made up most of our diet. Colorado State University researchers found that a whopping 72% of what we eat today was not eaten for at least 99.8% of our history. The diet which helped us avoid obesity and diabetes for hundreds of thousands of years has been flipped on its head. Is it any wonder that our health and fitness have been flipped on their heads as well? Over 70% of our diet is made up of unnatural food. Over 70% of us have unhealthy and inflated waistlines. Coincidence or common sense? Of course, some people might object, back then, people didn't live as long as we do now. That is an excellent point, and I felt the same way until I discovered research that reveals 3 little-known facts about our ancestors. First, they are few and far between today, but hunter-gatherer tribes are still around, and scientists have studied them extensively. The study showed that these civilizations are free from obesity, diabetes, and heart disease. 2. While their average age of death is lower than ours, many of our ancient ancestors lived well beyond the age of 60. Back to Dr. S. Boyd Eaton. Occasionally, one hears claims that primitive people all died too young to get degenerative diseases. This claim is simply false. Many lived well into and through the age of vulnerability to such disorders, yet didn't get them. 3. Let's take old age out of the equation entirely. Obese and type 2 diabetic civilized children are running around all over the place. The children of our ancestors were free of obesity and diabetes. It's not a coincidence that the decline in the quality of our food has coincided with the decline in the quality of our health. We are not designed to digest the majority of foods we're being told to eat. Dr. Walter Willett, chair of the Harvard School of Public Health, states unequivocally, "The USDA pyramid is wrong. It was built on shaky scientific ground and has been steadily eroded by new research from all parts of the globe. At best, it offers wishy-washy, scientifically unfounded advice." The Journal of the American College of Cardiovascular Exercisology makes this connection. The low-fat, high-carbohydrate diet promulgated vigorously by the food pyramid may well have played an unintended role in the current epidemics of obesity, diabetes, and metabolic syndromes. Michael F. Jacobson, the co-founder of the Center for Science and the Public Interest, offers a blunt assessment. Good advice about nutrition conflicts with the interest of many big industries, each of which has more lobbying power than all of the public interest groups combined. Decades of advanced dietary research have taken place alongside spiking obesity and diabetes rates. This research clearly recommends a diet much different from any version of the government's dietary guidelines. For example, Marion Nestle, PhD, MD, professor of nutrition, food studies, and public health at New York University, notes how the scientific community has long criticized the USDA's food guide pyramid's failure to recognize that sugar and starch are biochemically equivalent within the body. Starch has the same impact on your body as sugar, says Donald Lehman, PhD, professor of nutrition at the University of Illinois. All starches from all grains are simply a long chain of simple sugars connected together. The term complex carbohydrate just means a long chain of sugars. As soon as a food is digested and absorbed, the body does not know the difference between a simple sugar and a whole grain. Why don't the government guidelines reflect this research? Why is a food that is biochemically equivalent to sugar recommended in mass quantities? A great deal of money is being made from our nutritional confusion. The history of the USDA guidelines and graphics is nothing short of shocking. New heading: Politicians Playing Physicians. Detailing the disturbing history of the government's role on our diet would take an entire book. If you would like to find out the whole story, you can read an excellent book called Good Calories, Bad Calories by Gary Taubes. Here's the short version. The original release of the governmental document Dietary Guidelines for Americans and subsequent Food Guide Pyramid and My Plate graphics came about because certain politicians were playing physicians. Harvard School of Public Health professor Walter Willett, MD, PhD, MPH, notes, "Some recommendations on diet and nutrition are misguided because they are based on inadequate or incomplete information. This hasn't been the case for the USDA's pyramids. They are wrong because they brush aside evidence on healthful eating that has been carefully assembled over the past 40 years. In the Journal of American Physicians and Surgeons, public health scientist Alice Ottobiani, PhD, adds, "There is considerable concern today that the diet the pyramid illustrates is responsible for the current epidemic of cardiovascular disease. The concurrent epidemics of obesity and type 2 diabetes are unintended consequences that can also be attributed to this diet." How did the government come up with these dietary guidelines to begin with? In the 1980s, when the guidelines were first introduced, scientists did not have a good understanding of what would happen if most people adopted these guidelines. In fact, the dietary guidelines and graphics weren't even drawn up by nutrition scholars. They were derived from a political document released in 1976 called Dietary Goals for the United States. Dietary goals was designed by the Senate Select Committee on Nutrition and Human Needs to do two things. The first was to increase carbohydrate consumption to account for 55% to 60% of calorie intake. The second was to reduce overall fat consumption from 40% to about 30% of calorie intake. These goals and the rest of the document are more speculative than scientific. Dr. Stuart Truswell, professor in the School of Molecular Bioscience at the University of Sydney, tells us, "The first edition of Dietary Goals took nutritionists by surprise. It was written by a group of politically interested activists with a small knowledge of nutrition. The collected objections can be summarized very briefly. Too soon, more research needed, relationships not proved, politically motivated. Even the American Medical Association was worried when Dietary Goals was released, lamenting the potentially harmful effects of such a radical long-term dietary change. Scientists at the University of Wisconsin-Madison called the Goals report not scientifically sound, referring to it as a political and moralistic document. Perhaps the most telling objection came from the president of the National Academy of Sciences in his very testimony to the Senate in regards to the dietary goals. What right has the federal government to propose that the American people conduct a vast nutritional experiment with themselves as the subjects on the strength of so very little evidence that it will do them any good? But although Dietary Goals was unproved and controversial among the scientific community, the government declared it the truth on these grounds. We, the government, live in the present and cannot afford to wait for ultimate proof before correcting trends we believe to be detrimental. With that uneducated guess, the low-fat, low-protein, high-starch diet was declared healthy. Sadly, the results have been far from healthy. To understand why the Senate Nutrition Committee gave us these dietary goals in the first place, we have to go back a few more decades. One man single-handedly convinced the entire country that natural foods are deadly. New heading: Fat Fiction. In the 1950s, Ansel Keys examined diet and heart disease trends in 22 countries. He was apparently more interested in headlines than science because he then published a study that included data from only 6 countries that showed a frightening link between dietary fat and heart disease. Keys garnered a massive amount of press and then went on tour armed with the message that eating fat is deadly. Here are the facts. When the data from all 22 countries in Keys' own study are examined, they show no relationship between dietary fat intake and heart disease. Keys selectively picked data and designed a headline-worthy conclusion. In the words of a fellow researcher, no information is given by Keys on how or why the 6 countries were selected. Further exposing the randomness of Keys' methods, those same researchers revealed that by selectively choosing 6 different countries from Keys' data, they could create a graph suggesting that eating more fat decreases the risk of dying from heart disease. Finally, looking at Keys' data a few years later, they concluded the examination of all available basic data shows that the association between fat and heart disease lacks validity. They also discovered a strong negative association for both animal protein and fat with mortality from all non-cardiac disease. Even the American Medical Association spoke up in protest. The anti-fat, anti-cholesterol fad is not just foolish and futile, it also carries some risk. No matter. The fat is evil myth started a nationwide campaign to replace natural foods containing fat with fat-free products and climaxed with the government's dietary guidelines, food guide pyramid, My Pyramid, and My Plate diets. Those diets are high in starch because starch is low in fat. Unfortunately, over $1 billion worth of studies have failed to prove that the government's guidelines are good for anything other than profits. For instance, Harvard Medical School's position on the government's eating guidelines is unambiguous. Few public health messages are as powerful and as persistent as this one. Fat is bad. The average American has substantially reduced the percentage of calories that she or he gets from fat over the past 3 decades, but we are not any healthier for all of this effort. In fact, we're worse off because of it. Numerous studies have been unable to find a link between dietary fat and heart disease. When Patty W. Siri Torino, PhD, of the Children's Hospital and Research Center in Oakland, examined 21 studies that included a total of 347,747 people, he found there is no significant evidence for concluding that dietary saturated fat is associated with an increased risk of heart disease or cardiovascular disease. The National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute funded an enormous trial designed to link the consumption of foods containing fat to heart disease. The $115 million multiple risk factor intervention trial took 12,866 men with high cholesterol, split them into 2 groups, and fed one group the government guidelines diet for 7 years with the hopes of lowering the incidence of heart disease. The government's diet resulted in a 7.1% increase in heart disease deaths. The Women's Health Initiative of the National Institutes of Health completed a $700 million study to test the fat hypothesis. A whopping 48,835 women ate their normal diet or the government diet for about 8 years. At the end of the study, the regular and government diet women weighed the same and no differences were found in their health. The researchers concluded dietary intervention that reduced total fat intake did not significantly reduce the risk of coronary heart disease, stroke, or cardiovascular disease. As reported in the study, this trial is the largest long-term randomized trial of dietary intervention ever conducted to our knowledge, and it achieved a 8.2% reduction in total fat intake. No significant effects on the incidence of coronary heart disease or stroke were observed. In response to this study, on February 8, 2006, the New York Times ran the headline, "Low-Fat Diet Does Not Cut Health Risks, Study Finds." A massive study, abbreviated MONICA, involved 113 groups of scientists and doctors in 27 countries studying everything they thought could possibly contribute to heart disease. They found little, if any, association between the average cholesterol level and heart-related mortality. In the Western Electric study, known in academic circles as one of the most informative prospective studies to date, researchers concluded, although the focus of dietary recommendations is usually a reduction of saturated fat intake, no relation between saturated fat intake and risk of coronary heart disease was observed in this study. The government was trying to help with their guidelines, but sadly, it failed. The Harvard Medical School professor of medicine, Frank Hugh, MD, MPH, PhD, tells us plainly, "It is now significantly recognized that the low-fat campaign has been based on little scientific evidence and may have caused unintended health consequences." Even worse, the horrible health consequences continue. Researchers know it, and the data show it. In the next chapter, we'll clear up the confusion at the heart of the low-fat and low-cholesterol myths. Sidebar. It's all about results, a pragmatism primer. A pragmatist is someone who's results-oriented. They believe something is right or wrong based on its results. People can try anything they want, and the true worth of the program is revealed by its results. If it works, it's right. If it fails, it's wrong. When it comes to weight loss, the pragmatic assessment would be based on this question: does the weight loss program cause you to lose body fat and keep it off forever without compromising the rest of your life? If so, then it's right. If not, then it's wrong. Unfortunately, this common sense approach is not common practice. Despite the decades of data and tens of millions of overweight people that prove traditional calorie counting, starvation dieting, weight loss programs are wrong, those people have been brainwashed into thinking that somehow they failed because they didn't lose any weight. That's ridiculous. It's the weight loss programs that failed them, not the other way around. As Baylor University researchers put it so well, the efficacy of any treatment of obesity can be appraised only by the permanence of the result. And by that metric, we know that calorie counting and starvation dieting based programs are wrong.